In today's Diablo 4 video, we're gonna talk about the Sorcerer class. It shares many similarities and spells from Diablo 2, but also a few unique mechanics that, in my opinion, makes it one of the more fun classes to play. I'm gonna cover more about my time in Diablo 4's beta, so if you want to see more videos like that, totally let me know down below in the comments. I'm also doing another giveaway for Diablo 4 Deluxe Edition. All you have to do is to be a subscriber to the channel and leave a like on this video. Now, Sorcerer is described as a high-risk, high-reward class, and after spending more than a dozen hours with it, I can definitely agree with that. Your damage spells oftentimes feel strong right off the gate, but the cost you pay is in the significant weaker defenses compared to most other classes. Luckily, spells like the Fire and Ice Armor, Deep Freeze, and extensive access to crowd control mechanics eventually do make up for it. Now, Sorcerer also has access to a unique mechanic called enchantment slots, which gives almost all of your skills, with the exception of the ultimate ones, a secondary passive use at the cost of no longer being able to actively cast them. For example, you could choose to place the Meteor skill in the enchantment slot rather than the active skill bar. By default, if you use this manually, you cast down a Meteor at the point of impact. If you choose to place it in the enchantment slot, however, you can no longer cast it actively, but it will now give you a bonus chance for random meteors to drop down on enemies that are burning. This can create really interesting situations and skill combos where you can take advantage of certain debuffs or interactions to cause the effects from certain active abilities to trigger. Some of them are more powerful than others, which is why I'll also mention some of them as we break down the entire class skill tree. Just like in the case of the Rogue class, Sorcerer skill tree is also made out of 7 nodes, starting with the basic skills, the core ones, all the way to the Conjuration, Mastery, and then Ultimate. In the basic node, you get access to 4 elemental spells right from the very start, including Firebolt, Frostbolt, Spark, and Arclash. Fire and Frostbolt are the most straightforward. The first one lets you hurl a flaming bolt at the enemy, dealing some damage and applying a high damage burn effect over time, while the second one lets you throw a bolt of frost that deals damage and instead applies a 15% chill effect onto the enemies. Between these two, the Frostbolt has the more immediate damage, but Firebolt opens up interesting interactions with the burn over time mechanic with some of the later on skills. Meanwhile, for the two lightning skills called Arclash and Spark, the difference mainly consists in the range and the effects that they give. While Spark is a longer range spell that can shock and jump to additional targets, Arclash is more of a close to mid-range swipe that can also have the ability to stun enemies after casting it a number of times. Whichever route you go with, from my experience, it was almost always better to stick to 1 or a max 2 elementals so that you can get all of the benefits and mechanics out of it and truly reach the max potential from the very start. Moving on to the second node, this again contains 6 active options between the 3 elements we just talked about. So for fire, we have Fireball and Incinerate, where the first one hurls a giant ball of fire that deals massive damage to surrounding enemies. If you place this in the enchantment slot, however, enemies will explode in a fireball for 50% of its initial damage whenever you kill them, so it could work with a fire build in that way. Incinerate, on the other hand, lets you channel a fire beam that progressively increases every second you hold the casting, but you can also modify this so that it starts at 100% power and then slowly decreases in damage as the cast goes on. For Frost, we have a couple of options. One of them is the Frozen Orb. This manually unleashes an orb that chills enemies and expels damage-dealing shards before exploding once it expires. If you place this in the enchantment slot, it can have a pretty interesting effect. Whenever you cast non-basic skills, there's a 20% chance to launch additional Frozen Orbs by default, so that can be quite awesome. Ice Shard, on the other hand, launches 5 ice shards that deal damage and further gains a 25% damage buff if you use it against enemies that are already frozen. It's a great single target boss melter as it would shoot the shards in a straight line, but you do have to be careful not to miss them. If you place them in the enchantment slot, however, these automatically conjure and will fly towards frozen enemies whenever you freeze them. Finally, there's also a couple of lightning spells in the same node. One of them is Chain Lightning, also my favorite and one of the best AoE skills early on, as it jumps between up to 5 enemies, dealing increased damage for each one of them depending on the modifiers that you picked. And then the charge bolts releases 5 bolts of electricity that course across the ground in an erratic pattern. And around this level is where you would start feeling quite powerful. You do a lot of AoE damage, it jumps to a lot of enemies, but you're still kinda in that place where you lack a lot of the defenses, which I believe the fact that Blizzard chose to put defensive skills in the third node is such a good decision. You now have access to the Flame and Ice armor, Nova for the CC, and teleports to disengage, all in the third node, so between like the first 15 to 20 levels. Good to know that they also have enchantment slot effects, so instead of actively triggering something like the flame shield for example, you could place it in the enchantment slot and forget about it, and this one will auto trigger instead whenever you get fatal damage, but it is going to be on a 2-minute cooldown. Meanwhile, if you get the ice armor in the same enchantment slot, instead of getting its normal barrier, you get a 5% chance for it to trigger on every single hit. Frost Nova would probably give you the best use though. If you use this actively, you can just freeze enemies around you for several seconds whenever the cooldown is off, but if you put it in the enchantment slot, this instead would give you a 30% chance to trigger every time you do a critical strike. Finally, teleport, pretty straightforward and useful at traversal. If you use this in the enchantment slot, however, it replaces the normal evade with the teleport instead, but it also inherits the cooldown from the teleport. So instead of the 5 seconds, you now have a 16 seconds on that action. Conjuration is the fourth node. This deals with a lot of summons and cool skills. One of them, also familiar from Diablo 2 if you played it, is the Hydra skill, where you kind of summon 3-headed Hydras from the ground that starts spitting fire towards enemies for around 8 seconds. You can also place this in the enchantment slot, however, to summon a Hydra head whenever you kill an enemy that is burning. That's why I said it's important to dedicate a build around a certain elemental so you can take the most out of it. In this case, if you go with damage over time from fire, you get these options from skills like the Meteor we talked about, as well as the Hydra. There's also another one for a couple more skills, including the Ice Blades. This one conjures an Ice Blade for around 6 seconds that slashes enemies and deals damage. So it's quite nice, but if you place it in the enchantment slot, it basically gives you a 10% chance to summon more Ice Blades for every single character that you kill. So you're going to notice that if you go with the enchantment slot route, you can summon a lot more of these Ice Blades to the point that you can probably overwhelm the battlefield, and this was already the case even by level 25. There's also the Lightning Spear in this category. You can create a crackling spear of lightning that seeks enemies for around 6 seconds, so it basically seeks them out, deals some nice AoE damage, jumps from one enemy to the next, but it's like not something that I went with exclusively in my build. Mastery comes up at the 5th node. In this one, you hold bigger, more impactful area of effect abilities. Blizzard is one of them. You basically call down a frigid blizzard, it deals damage, chills enemies for around 6 seconds, but you can also have this automatically on the enchantment slot. And what happens is that it will start triggering in the enchantment slot every 15 seconds and will also follow you for up to 4 seconds. So you kind of have to make a decision if you want to actively use it or passively have it in the enchantment slot. And I totally believe the second variant is much better. As I've said, Meteor is also one of them. If you use it on the active skill bar, you call it whenever you want to, as long as the cooldown is off, and it just slams onto the ground, dealing damage and leaving off some fire effect on the ground. But if you put it in the enchantment slot, it has a chance to trigger around a 3% chance every time an enemy is burning. So that can be quite awesome if you can reliably set afire a ton of enemies at the same time. Firewall, another one that makes a comeback from Diablo 2, creates a wall of fire that deals damage over 8 seconds, so it can be a really awesome spell. And finally, Ball of Lightning in the Mastery category. You conjure a ball of lightning that slowly moves forward, continuously zapping enemies in its path. Very similar to the Frozen Orb, except that it just zaps enemies, it doesn't freeze them. Now, the ultimate skill node is where it becomes a bit more interesting and you truly start getting some of those devastating skills. Not that the previous ones weren't, but you're getting some that can already deal like 10k damage at around level 25 with like not full legendary gear. So Deep Freeze, definitely the one that I used. It encases you in ice for 4 seconds, which means it makes you completely immune during its duration, but it also freezes and deals massive shatter damage before it explodes to all enemies around you. The AoE on this is huge, so you can affect a ton of them when you're getting overwhelmed and when you're fighting bosses. Also one of the longest cooldowns at around 1 minute, so do keep that in mind. Inferno is another one. This one ignites a roaring inferno that pulses in and around the target area, dealing massive damage before exploding over 8 seconds. And finally, Unstable Current. Lightning surges through you whenever you use a lightning skill. You automatically cast a second random non-basic lightning spells. So this could be a pretty awesome one if you want to build around a more RNG kind of build, but get a lot of these zapping options, a lot of electricity all around, so kind of make you feel like Zeus, I might say. There's also a 7th node with a ton of options over here, but I will only cover about 3 of them because these are the ones that I found to be the most interesting. Icefall for a frost build would probably be the best. This has a 10% chance to make your next ice shard, frozen orb, and blizzard to consume no mana and deal 40% more damage. Overflowing energy is another one. This makes crackling energy to hit 1 additional target, and every time it hits a target, all of your shock skills get their cooldowns reduced by 0.1 seconds if you hit normal enemies with it, or 0.25 seconds if you hit elites. Warmth is a third one, gives you a 50% chance to gain 1 mana for each source of burning onto the enemy. And if you do a lot of burns, as I've said, if you go with that dot kind of build, you can totally apply this and kind of get a ton of mana so that you can spam your skills even more. There's a few more, including Isu's Ferocity, deals more damage if enemies are over a certain percentage health or if they're under a certain percentage health. And it can be quite interesting, but the first 2 were definitely the most interesting and the ones that I would personally choose if I were to pick the class all over again. This is pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.